Alright guys, welcome back. We are up to topic 5.8. This is going to cover the military aspect of the Civil War, and a lot of the politics stuff we're going to save for the next video. Now this is going to be a little bit longer than some of our other videos in the past just because there's so much content in 5.8. I mean, we're covering literally the entire Civil War from beginning to end. And now that means then, of course, not only is the video going to be longer, but also just the fact that we're going to have to leave a lot of stuff out, even though the video is going to be longer, just because the Civil War was, incredible an event, 4 years of conflict and many battles, of which we aren't going to talk about, but we're going to cover the big ones. So let's get into the factors that explain why the Union won the Civil War. That's our big focus for this video. And of course we have to get the war going, and that takes us to South Carolina, to Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter right down here on the coast of South Carolina. Remember, South Carolina was the first state to secede. They did so almost immediately after Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. So the opening shots of this battle, and for that matter the entire Civil War, takes place on April 12, 1861. For 34 hours, the Confederacy bombarded this federal fort. Now, a little bit of background. This fort was built way before the Civil War to protect the harbor here in Charleston, South Carolina. So most of its guns are pointed outward because that would be where the threat was coming from. And so these Confederate batteries around here, they have a big advantage on Fort Sumter. After 34 hours, the Union garrison surrendered. Now, nobody died in this battle, which is kind of ironic because this will, of course, be the bloodiest war America's ever fought. But in this first battle, it was bloodless. Now, the fall of Fort Sumter has a huge effect on both North and South. So let's talk about the North first. This was really the moment where talk of secession and all that kind of stuff, that's where talk ended and action starts. And we now have, Americans shooting other Americans on a different scale than what Bleeding Kansas had been. This is something bigger and newer. And so people who had been relatively indifferent about secession, they were kind of like, whatever, let the South go, who cares? Now all of a sudden they have a real reason to fight hard. And so Lincoln is going to make a call for 75,000 volunteers to join the militia to put down this rebellion. And that is, that 75,000 compared to the modern day military is not much, but compared to the military we had before the Civil War, that's a huge increase. Here's a pretty interesting painting. It's one of my favorite Civil War era paintings, and it's obviously it's got some nationalism going on here, and once you see it, you can't unsee it because, of course, that's the American flag right there, right? And there's the blue and then the stripes and all that stuff. So, pretty cool painting. Now, let's look at the South. What kind of effect is the fall of Fort Sumter going to have on the South? And the effect is that 4 more states are going to secede to join the original. So now the Confederacy, as we know it, in terms of its final composition, is there. And with Lincoln's call for a militia, a lot of Southerners are going to see this as a potential invasion of the South, and so the South is going to call up their militias, and both sides are arming for a fight. So these are the states that seceded before Fort Sumter. These are the states that secede after Fort Sumter. Tennessee, the last state to secede. Here's a pretty interesting map. It shows you kind of by election district, I guess it is, or maybe it's county. I'm not sure exactly what they're going for here. But they're showing who's voting for and against articles of secession in these various states. And you can definitely see secession not very popular in eastern Tennessee, western Virginia, and northern Alabama. All right, now before we get into the other battles, let's talk about the so-called border states. These would be slave states like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, that while being slave states, they don't actually secede. They're going to be kind of like officially neutral in this war. Now, had the border states gone the way of secession, this would have given the Confederate states a huge advantage. They would have gotten way more resources, more people, did more opportunities, would have been far more threatening to the North, especially for Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., remember, is sandwiched between Virginia and Maryland. So if Maryland were to secede, the nation's capital literally would have been completely surrounded by the Confederacy. So let's think about Lincoln and his war goal here. And we're going to do a little true-false. True or false, Lincoln's primary goal was to end slavery. Well, it turns out that's not true, especially in the beginning part of the war. The early part of the war, Lincoln's goal here is to maintain the Union, to save the Union at all costs. It's not about a fight to free slaves. And one of the reasons he was wary of calling this a war to end slavery was he knew this would offend and infuriate a lot of people in the border states, might cause them to secede. There were also a lot of people in the southern part of the Union who were reluctant to fight a war to end slavery. And this gives the Union kind of the moral high ground. We're fighting for a high ideal of maintaining the Union. This quote here from Lincoln I think is very telling. It's from August of 1862. He says, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." So again, it's not about ending slavery. It's about saving the Union. Obviously, that war goal will change later, but we have some other events to get through first. All right, let's look at the so-called balance of forces, see who's got the advantage in this war. And let's be honest, it's not even close. Okay, so the Union has more people, more factories, bigger economy, more railroads, more textiles, more food, more horses. I mean, they outnumber the Confederacy in pretty much everything that matters, especially things like firearms. We're fighting a war here, and 32-1 advantage for the Union. On paper, the Union really can't lose this war. This shows you kind of the balance of forces in terms of number of men, and you can definitely tell that the South is at a disadvantage throughout this war. I mean, they're never even come close to the number of Union soldiers in uniform in this war. And yet, the South has some advantages. Number one, they can fight defensively. And you always need fewer defenders than attackers. It's easier to hold on to ground than to take ground. They have a higher sense of morale at first because they see themselves as fighting a second war for independence. And they have better officers, especially early in the war. People who just know how to fight and lead soldiers better. People like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and others. The South, though, has a world of problems. They've got a shortage of pretty much everything you can imagine in this war. And when we think of the South, we always talk about how it's far more agricultural and everything, but because of its poor transportation system, it really can't take advantage of that. And what's happening is food really can't be transported very easily across the South, which means you have a lot of hungry people, even though, again, the South is more agricultural. Ironically enough, hunger is going to be a big problem throughout this war, especially in the last year or so. The Confederacy is really going to be running low on everything. All right, other weaknesses for the Confederates, their government was pretty weak. Remember, a lot of the people who were in favor of secession said they were seceding because of states' rights, that no federal government should be able to tell the states what to do. Well, okay, that's fine in theory, but what about when it comes to the Confederate government? Can they tell the states what to do? And a lot of Confederate states basically said no. And so a lot of these states squabbled and argued, and the federal government of the Confederacy was weak to the point of being really almost, I won't say non-existent, but certainly not fit for the job ahead of them. All right, let's look at the northern advantages, of which there are tons. So yes, the North is more industrialized. We know that. Everybody knows that. But it turns out the North is also really, really good at growing crops. I mean, you're talking about some of the best farmlands in the world right through here. And so the the North is able to outproduce the South in both farming and industry in this war. Also, the South doesn't have a navy, the North does. And so the North can use that navy to set up a blockade surrounding the South, which really prevents the South from being able to export anything or import anything, which, makes it really difficult for their economy to continue to function. The North also has an advantage of a growing population, and not just natural growth, but also immigration. In fact, about 20% of all Union soldiers in this war are going to be foreign-born. So these are people who either had recently immigrated, or maybe their parents moved over here when they were young, or whatever. These are people who are new Americans who are fighting for the Union. And remember, you don't really see a lot in the South because the South didn't have the same levels of immigration. There are the numbers. We've seen this. I find it pretty amazing that even during the Civil War, immigration is actually accelerating. I mean, what does it say about the country you're leaving if you're like, I think I'll go to America where there's a civil war raging, right? I mean, that's pretty astounding stuff. However, the North is not exactly invincible, right? They have some problems of their own. One is going to be really poor military leaders, again, especially in the early part of the war, where Lincoln's trying to find someone who can do what he needs them to do. It's kind of like, try this leader, that doesn't work, try that general, that didn't work. You also have this issue of kind of a divided population. Remember, even though Lincoln says this isn't a war to end slavery, at least early on, a lot of people thought it was, and a lot of Northerners did not want to fight to end slavery. They didn't see it as worth their life to free slavery. All right, here we are looking at some Northern leaders. Obviously, some of these are going to be kind of duds. McClellan is a pretty mixed bag. We're going to talk more about him later. But the one we all remember, of course, is Ulysses S. Grant. And we'll talk a lot more about him later as well. All right, so let's now think about King Cotton. So we might remember during the American Revolution, a major reason for American success was the intervention of the French. And the South is really hoping that the British will play that role for them in this war. They're counting on foreign intervention. Obviously, the British is their number one hope, but they're also hoping maybe the French will help out, or whomever, right? Anybody. The problem with this is those European countries are also divided on this issue of the American Civil War. While there were a lot of upper-class people in Europe, particularly in Britain, who were favoring the South, the working classes didn't. They didn't see this as they didn't want to fight a war against America to maintain slavery when slavery was already outlawed across most European countries. Why would Britain fight a war to save slavery when they gave up on that same system 30 years before this? So why foreign intervention never materializes? Well, a couple reasons. Number one, Britain already had a lot of surplus cotton in country, so they can kind of get by for a while without southern cotton. And they also find other sources. They're going to get cotton from Egypt. They're going to get cotton from India. They're also going to get cotton from America, just not from the Confederacy, from the Union. And what's happening is the Union pushes south. They're capturing a lot of those cotton-producing lands, and they're simply selling off that cotton. So Britain isn't cut off from American cotton, ironically enough, in this war. It's just not from the Confederacy. So there's, again, Civil War raging, and Britain's like, you know what, I think I'll go get my cotton somewhere else, like maybe India. All right, so let's look at the plan for victory for the Union. So let's think about Lincoln. How is he going to win against the South? How do you put down this rebellion? So we have 6 big strategies that Lincoln's going to use. Number one, the blockade, right? Smother the South, just basically force them into submission. Number 2, we're going to try to liberate slaves as we invade the South. This will weaken the Southern economy. Number 3, cut the South in half by seizing the Mississippi River. Number 4, drive through Georgia and then divide the South once again. So you're going to divide the South here, you're going to divide the South there. That's the plan. Kind of here and there. In other words, cut it into pieces and then kill it off. Number 5, decapitate the Confederacy by capturing the capital city of Richmond. And then number 6, just fight the Confederacy anywhere and everywhere you can find them. Grind them down, win battle after battle. You know you're going to take heavy losses as the Union, but you have more soldiers, and you're going to have to grind them down until the South finally gives up. The Anaconda Plan, you might remember learning that term in 8th grade. That's what we're talking about. Strangle the South. So you can see our plans, right? We're going to attack, cut through the rivers, blockade them, cut them off. That's the winning strategy. All right, so we're going to focus on just a couple of battles here in the Civil War. Our first big battle of note is something called the Battle of Antietam. This takes place right here in southern Maryland, not too far away from Virginia. And what happens is in the summer of 1862, a Southern army under Robert E. Lee is going to invade Maryland. They're invading Maryland for a couple of reasons. One, they're trying to really win that big stunning victory, kind of like a Saratoga type victory from the American Revolution, which will get foreigners to fight on the side of the South. They're also trying to encourage the border states to secede by showing off their military power and beating the North on a couple of battles. Now, the two armies are going to clash again in Maryland on September 17th, 1862. At the end of the day, George McClellan, who is the Union general in charge, he fights Lee to basically a draw. Okay, it's not, the thing about Antietam is it's hard to say it's a victory one way or the other. I mean, I guess you can call it a victory in the sense that at least the Southern invasion was kind of deflected and turned back, but it wasn't a stunning victory like the Union was hoping for. It also turns out to be the bloodiest single day of the war. There will be other bloodier battles, but those are battles that took place over multiple days. This is the bloodiest single-day battle in the war. Over 20,000 Americans were killed or wounded on that one fateful day. Here's a picture of some Confederate forces marching through corn, getting shot at. And there is Lincoln meeting with McClellan after the battle. And Lincoln is going to fire McClellan. This is the second time he's relieved from command, and these two men will face off again, not on a battlefield, but on the ballot. In 1864, Lincoln and McClellan are going to face each other in a presidential election. So, Lee had marched into the North and invaded Maryland for all those reasons we just talked about, trying to spark foreign intervention, trying to get the border states to secede. His goals are not fulfilled. So, Britain and France, who had been, toying with the idea of intervening in the war, decide no, we're not going to do that. This also gives Lincoln an opportunity, a little bit of breathing room to issue, or at least, announce this thing called the Emancipation Proclamation. So he's going to announce it in September of 1862, and it's going to go into effect on the first day of 1863. And we'll get into the details of the Emancipation Proclamation a little bit later. But again, the Battle of Antietam, that's where it's going to come from. All right, next battle, the Battle of Gettysburg. This is going to be in the summer of 1863. You can see the route that Lee's armies are going to take up to the north. So Lee once again invades the North. Same strategy, guys, as the previous summer. We're trying to encourage the foreigners to intervene. We're trying to encourage the border states to secede. We're trying to encourage Northerners who are against the war to demand that the government end the war. The South is starting to get kind of desperate, honestly, at this point, and this is a big gamble. So the two sides are going to meet near Gettysburg, or Gettysburg, as it was called back then. Again, this is in southern Pennsylvania. It's going to be the single biggest battle of the war. It takes place between July 1st and 3rd of 1863. Incredibly hot summer that year was. Imagine being one of these soldiers wearing a wool uniform in hot July weather. This is going to be just an absolute massive clash of arms. And at the end of the day, this will be the single bloodiest battle. Some 6,000 Americans are going to die on those 3 days. 28,000 wounded. Now, the battle was a pretty close-run thing for the first and second day. The third day, the South really kind of gambles and launches what's known as Pickett's Charge. Let me show you a map here. So here's kind of the layout. You can see the red lines here are your Confederate positions, and you've got the Union in green. And Pickett's Charge is like this final last assault on Union forces, trying to break their hold, and it's going to fail. So once the Union wins and the Confederacy loses, this really is, at least on the battlefield anyways, kind of the last hope, the last gasp. That's not to say the war is going to end immediately. In fact, it won't. It'll continue for almost 2 more years. But it's pretty clear to everyone that the South's days are numbered. All right, well, let's go out west and take a look at this guy, Ulysses Grant, see what he's up to. And so Grant is going to first make his name on this campaign to take the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers off the table and kind of rip open Middle Tennessee. He's going to take Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, then he's going to cross over some land and take Fort Donelson. This is called Land Between the Lakes right up here. Many of us here in Middle Tennessee are familiar with that territory. And by securing both of these rivers, the Confederacy really is going to be forced out of most of Tennessee. There's the so-called Surrender House in Dover, Tennessee. This is where the two sides met, and Grant told the South to surrender, and the Southern commander basically said, well, what are your terms? And Grant says, unconditional. Like, you surrender, you get nothing. You don't get to keep anything. It's unconditional surrender or the battle continues. All right, so after that, you can see Grant's marching southward. You can see some naval forces coming up from the south going northward. And at Vicksburg, this is where Grant wins another stunning victory. So Vicksburg was basically the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. It was the last door that was keeping the West connected to the East. And once that door swings shut after a long siege, this is another big moment on the road to victory for the Union. The Confederates have no choice but to surrender. And they surrendered on July 4th, 1863, which happens to be the day after they lost at Gettysburg. So these are two back-to-back massive defeats for the South, just huge blows that they can't recover from. By the way, a little twist of fate here, Vicksburg, Mississippi, because they surrendered on July 4th, 1863, this was something that they felt like they didn't want to celebrate going forward. And for the next, I think, 70 years or so, Vicksburg refused to celebrate the 4th of July. They didn't start doing that again until, I think, the 1940s, if my memory serves me well. Okay, now, so let's talk about kind of the end game here of the war, and we're going to look at Sherman's march, which it's not labeled on the map, but you can basically see where Sherman's march is going to take place. So, who's Sherman? Well, that is General William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the North's best commanders. He had been kind of Grant's right-hand man in the Western campaign, and now as Grant heads off to take over the eastern half of things, he leads William Tecumseh Sherman behind. He's going to capture Atlanta in September of 1864, right there, and then set basically the city on fire. Their goal then is to set out for the port city of Savannah. So we're going to march here to there, a distance of about 250 miles. And this is that infamous Sherman's March, where basically the Union tears about a 60-mile wide swath of destruction right through the heart of the Confederacy, burning plantations, ripping up rail lines, freeing slaves, chasing down Confederate soldiers as they retreat. It really is just a gut punch to the South is what it is. Here's the northern soldiers. They're pulling up the rail lines so that the South can't reuse them, and to make sure they're totally useless, what they would do is they would heat them up and wrap them around into these tangles. They were called Sherman's neckties. So the end result of Sherman's march was it definitely led to a greater number of Southern soldiers deserting, and desertion is going to be a major problem for the South in this war. And while it certainly was harsh, there's no doubt that it helps quicken the end of the war. All right, final days of the war, guys. We are now up to 1865, and it's Grant versus Lee over control of Virginia. Remember, one of the key ingredients in all this war is the Union's got to take the capital city of Richmond, and that's what Grant is going to do. He's going to fight his way through here, try to get to Richmond. Now, in the final months of the war, the South is really going to dig in developing pretty elaborate trench works that are almost reminiscent of something out of the First World War later on in history. And so the Union is going to take heavy casualties having to fight their way through these fortifications. And in fact, what's really interesting about this is if you look at Union losses in the war, notice that they spike in 1864. So the last year of the war was the bloodiest, really, for the Union. Richmond finally falls on April 3rd, 1865. Lincoln heads down there to check out the city, famously reaching there and shortly after the Confederate departure, even going to Jefferson Davis's office and sitting in his chair, sitting at his desk. There he is being greeted by some of the people in Richmond. So, with the fall of Richmond, there really is no hope. There's really no point even keeping this fight up. And so at a little place called Appomattox Courthouse, which was a town, not an actual building, Lee and Grant are going to meet to talk about ending of the war, a ceasefire between these two armies. And they agree to those terms, again, April 9th, 1865. That's the so-called Surrender House. They met in the parlor of this building. The building is still standing today. And Grant offers up pretty generous terms. And, for Grant, this was never a war to humiliate the South or to crush the South. It was more about, ending the war as quickly as possible to get back to all of us being Americans and kind of, just being part of a family again. And so he chides his soldiers, don't laugh at the rebel soldiers, don't hoot and holler as the Southerners, surrender. He allows Southern soldiers to take their horses home with them so they can use them for farming. Again, very generous terms. Okay, guys, I know that was an epically long video. So much information. I'm sure you're information overload. But that is the Civil War in a nutshell in terms of military stuff. In our next video, we're going to focus on the Civil War again, but this time more politically and government-based, and talk obviously about what happens to Abraham Lincoln as well.